Buenas Sanhafade. You're listening to Memoirs Pasifika, a podcast series exploring events, movements, and people in modern Micronesian history. I'm Tony Asios, the show's producer. Our anchor today is L.J. Castro of Saipan. He's a former congressman in the Northern Mariana Islands House of Representatives and is currently coordinator of the NMI's Youth Congress. Mr. Castro also serves as creative director of Guma Simiyan Manaina-ta, a dance troupe which showcases Chamorro culture through the performing arts. In 2017, he was granted the Governor's Humanities Award for preservation of traditional cultural practices in recognition of his work in promoting culture through song, chant, and dance. In this episode, Congressman Castro discusses several of the key moments and debates that occurred during the Northern Mariana Islands self-determination process of the 1960s and 70s, including the Marianas Political Status Commission's negotiations with the United States government to end the NMI's status as a US-administered Trust Territory. Through the so-called Covenant Agreement, the Northern Marianas were ultimately able to establish the islands as a Commonwealth of the United States with greater rights, autonomy, and citizenship. Okay, let's pass the mic to our man in Saipan.
World War II wreaked havoc on the remote western Pacific Islands collectively known as Micronesia. Several centuries of colonization by foreign powers had already caused significant harm to the region's indigenous cultures, languages, and seafaring traditions. But the war radically disrupted what traditional ways of life still remained, and thrust Micronesia into a unique position on the global chessboard. In 1945, the newly created United Nations Trusteeship Council was tasked with the oversight and administration of several dependent territories and colonies. They were to be placed under an international trusteeship system and administered, quote, in conformity with the best interests of their inhabitants, end quote. This included a mandate to assist them through a decolonization process to attain self-government or independence, either as separate nations or by joining neighboring independent countries. The UN created the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands in 1947 and placed it under the command of the United States. The TTPI was split into 6 districts spread across several thousand miles of the Pacific Ocean. It was comprised of the Micronesian islands of Yap, Palau, Pohnpei, Truk, now known as Chuuk, Kosrae, the Marshall Islands, and the 14 islands that make up the Northern Marianas. First, the U.S. Navy, and then the U.S. Department of the Interior administered this vast constellation of islands with different languages and cultures. Although the people of Micronesia were not asked if they wanted to be a part of the Trust Territory, this arrangement would last for several decades. While there are many fascinating people and events surrounding the Trust Territories and their decolonization journeys, this episode will focus mostly on the Northern Mariana Islands, its rejection of a Trust Territory status, and how it forged its own political path forward.
In 1963, I ran for the district legislature. Luckily, I got into that, and that's where I am concentrating my strength and my idea of trying to improve the life of the people here in Saipan, Lotantenian.
That was Vicente Naputi Santos speaking. For those listeners unfamiliar with the region, Saipan, Tinian, and Rota, also known as Luta, are the largest and most populated islands of the Northern Marianas, located in the Western Pacific. While federally appointed high commissioners and district administrators from the United States oversaw the Northern Marianas at this time, locally elected municipal and parliamentary forms of government were also established. Santos says the members of the newly formed Mariana Islands District Legislature were determined to use their growing influence to improve the territory's economic conditions and secure greater political autonomy. At that time, life was a struggle for most people in the Trust Territory districts, and the U.S. federal government was generally inattentive to the region's development needs.
Everything is slow. You know, the Trust Territory administered 6 different districts. And money coming from Washington, D.C. that's very little to spread around the different districts in Micronesia. And the Chamorro and the Carolinian family normally runs around 5 to 6 kids. And that's a lot for only 25 cents an hour. So we cannot survive that way.
Now here's Manuel Atalik Sablan, who is currently Executive Director of the NMI's Commonwealth Development Authority. But in the 1960s, he was just beginning his career as an economist with the TTPI government, headquartered in Saipan.
My involvement in this so-called Political Status Commission began at the time when I was working for the Trust Territory government as the Deputy Chief of Economic Development for the Trust Territory. And my involvement basically focused on economic development issues, not necessarily the CNMI, but the entire Micronesia.
In our interview, Sablan mentioned that the policies of the Trust Territory government did not adequately promote economic growth and enterprise. There were only a few locally owned businesses then, and what little money came into the district was from the U.S. or trade with neighboring Guam. Santos says the dire situation demanded big ideas and bold choices.
So, in 1963, the district legislature was created, and then from there on, we started to think what best to do with the economy and our people. And, we got something in our mind, an idea.
That idea was to end its status as a TTPI district and instead find a way to make the Northern Mariana Islands a permanent part of the United States. But how could this change in political status be accomplished? For many leaders in Saipan, the answer laid with their Chamorro cousins just 130 miles south.
Joining Guam would be the easiest way. Right next door, the people are all the same, pretty much related.
That was Pedro Agutu Tenorio, a future lieutenant governor of the Northern Mariana Islands and the Commonwealth's last resident representative to the United States.
They look at Guam as an example of a good living condition, good health, and education. So we look at Guam as an example of what the Marianas district could achieve if it joins with Guam.
Guam had been under American naval control from 1898 until 1941, when it was invaded and occupied by Imperial Japanese forces. After the U.S. military reclaimed the island in 1944, Guam was placed back under a naval government. But decades of petitions and pressure on the United States by Guam's people eventually culminated in the Organic Act of Guam. In 1950, this legislation made Guam an unincorporated territory of the United States, thereby removing it from under naval administration and allowing residents to elect in its place a local civilian government. The Organic Act also granted U.S. citizenship to Guam's residents and their descendants. These were seen as major advances at the time, even though Guam's people still couldn't yet elect their own governor, vote for president, or send voting representatives to the U.S. Congress. Still, many in the Northern Marianas considered these conditions to be far preferable to what they had as a trust territory. So, political leaders in Saipan pursued reunification with Guam as the most direct path to U.S. citizenship and economic prosperity.
Back then, Guam was already advanced. They have their own government, the so-called Organic Act, and they were already much advanced than Saipan. Their minimum wage is very good. They're making good money.
There was also a cultural aspect to the push for reunification, as it would once again bring the indigenous Chamorro people of Guam and the Northern Marianas under one government. After all, they share the same language and culture, and Guam is the southernmost island in the Mariana Archipelago. Their political separation in 1898 was not the will of the Chamorros, but a result of foreign conflicts and treaties between Western colonizers. This factor helps explain the sizable support for reunification between Guam and the rest of the Mariana Islands, but it was not an opinion shared by everyone.
The Northern Marianas people, or they call them the Marianas district at that time, has been always very political. And as a result of the intense interest in politics, which we learned from the U.S., I believe, we created two major parties.
At that time, they were known as the Popular Party and the Territorial Party, but would later become the Democratic and Republican parties respectively. The Popular Party's members campaigned for reunification, while the Territorial Party believed the better path to determining a future political status was through direct negotiations with the U.S. government. According to Santos, the partisanship made an already complex self-determination process even more challenging, and people worried about the unwelcome changes a new political status might bring.
First, it's not an easy endeavor because some people just don't like it to be part of the U.S. And they are afraid that they're going to lose their culture and they're going to lose many things that so dear to them after many years of administration under the Spanish, German, and then the Japanese. And they're kind of just questioning what's the benefit.
Local businessmen were worried about not being able to compete with the American businessmen already established on Guam. Arguments also arose from the Carolinian community on the matter. The Carolinians, or Refalawash as they are also known, are originally from the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, but have lived in the Northern Marianas since their villages were destroyed by a typhoon in the early 1800s. Due to their cultural roots to some of the other Micronesian islands in the TTPI, the Carolinian community pushed for a unified Micronesia. Nonetheless, several unofficial referenda had been held between 1958 and 1963, with the people of the Northern Marianas voting in favor of reunification each time. To further drive home the point, the Guam Legislature, the Saipan Congress, and the Mariana Islands District Legislature all passed resolutions calling for their reintegration. These referenda results and resolutions were repeatedly presented to the UN Trusteeship Council and American administrators. Each time, they were either ignored or outright rejected. But in 1969, reunification efforts regained momentum. A UN visiting mission was scheduled to arrive in Saipan the next year to assess the developing status of the trust territories, and pro-unification groups hoped to seize this opportunity to yet again present the mission with hard evidence of a long-standing desire to reintegrate the Marianas. So in November of 1969, Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands held referendums to conclusively answer the persistent question: should the archipelago unite to become a single territory of the United States? Leaders from both territories believed that reintegration would once again prevail at the ballot box. This time, however, they hoped the result would prove decisive in finally realizing the dream of forming a unified territory of the Marianas. In addition to reuniting the Chamorro people, the pro-reunification groups asserted that part of their overall goal was eventual American statehood. If Guam was expanded to include the Northern Marianas, they reasoned that statehood could be achieved much more quickly. Yet these dreams came to an abrupt end when Guam's voters rejected reunification. There were many explanations for this surprising turn of events, including low voter turnout, tax and financial concerns, and lingering resentments regarding the NMI's relationship with Japanese occupiers during World War II. Whatever the reasons, this development forced members of the Saipan Congress and Mariana Islands District Legislature to ask themselves a big question.
So what's next?
For Santos, the answer was clear.
The next is only going to the United States.
In 1971, a delegation of NMI officials traveled to Washington, D.C. to speak to the U.S. Congress and Department of the Interior. They insisted that the Northern Marianas be allowed to negotiate directly with the U.S. government, separate from the TTPI districts or Guam, with the goal of forming a permanent status in political union with the United States. This desire was also declared by the Marianas at that year's meeting of the United Nations Trusteeship Council. Again and again, these overtures were rebuffed. U.S. officials repeatedly encouraged the Mariana Islanders to direct their efforts toward working with the Congress of Micronesia to form a single Micronesian political entity. However, that idea garnered very little support with residents of the Marianas district. Frustrated by slow progress and competing interests, NMI officials threatened to leave the Trust Territory on February 19, 1971. The next day, the Micronesian Congress building in Saipan was set ablaze by an unknown arsonist. Then, the entire Northern Mariana delegation boycotted a special session scheduled for later in the year. Undeterred from their aspirations to somehow join the United States, the Mariana Islands District Legislature adopted a resolution in 1972 calling for separate negotiations from the rest of Micronesia and retained a law firm to represent their interests in Washington. Finally, after 2 decades of denying the NMI's requests, the United States relented. In April of 1972, U.S. Ambassador Franklin Hayden Williams formally announced that the United States was ready to enter into separate negotiations with the Northern Marianas. The very next month, the Marianas District Legislature created the Northern Marianas Political Status Commission. This 15-member body was tasked with representing the NMI in negotiations with the U.S. federal government to achieve an improved, self-governing territorial status. Each person interviewed in this episode was a member of the commission, with Vicente Santos serving as its vice chairman. Here again is Pedro Tenorio.
But the reason why there was a great impetus in creating the Political Status Commission was through because the people have always wanted to become part of the United States in some form. And the people here, our people, both sides, territorial and popular, they want American U.S. citizenship. My parents, your grandparents, they all joining in.
Political status negotiations began 5 months later at the Mount Carmel School Auditorium in Saipan. Ambassador Williams served as the personal representative of President Richard Nixon. After debating and weighing options, it became clear where the NMI's political status was headed.
We believe that a Commonwealth status will be the best choice. Something very new. It's brand new. And after meeting with the U.S. Ambassador William, we got a lot of good information.
In the initial stages of negotiation, the American delegation committed to granting the people of the Marianas some of the fundamental liberties associated with U.S. citizenship and a defined political status. But the Commission also insisted on maintaining control over who could own land in the Northern Marianas. The NMI delegation argued that other Pacific islands had suffered irreparable harm when their scarce land was quickly bought up by wealthy outsiders. To protect against exploitation while promoting economic advancement and self-sufficiency, the Mariana Islands stipulated that only persons defined as being of Mariana Islands descent could own land, but others could lease land in the long term. According to Tenorio, this was met with concern from the visiting contingent, who felt the U.S. Congress would never approve legislation that limited land ownership to specific ethnic groups.
Land alienation is supposedly in the minds of U.S. and U.S. citizens is discriminatory and unconstitutional, maybe, because if you're a U.S. citizen, you're entitled to buy land anywhere in the U.S., right? In the CNMI, in the Northern Marianas, we want to make sure that at least give our people the chance to be more familiar with the value of the land in terms of not only wealth, future wealth, but in terms of the culture, where you pass on properties to your future generation, to your offsprings. But here we got the agreement in the covenant to make sure that, we have our land at least protected to the point where we don't want to see a repetition of these issues or problem in Guam or Hawaii.
As a trained economist, Manuel Sablan's objective was to foster fiscal stability for his future government. He did this by securing economic opportunities and financial assistance commitments in the agreement.
Our job there was to formulate a multi-year socioeconomic development plan for the implementation of the covenant.
He also fought to reduce the cost of living and doing business by securing exemptions from certain protectionist regulations, such as the Jones Act. The Jones Act is a federal law that requires goods shipped between U.S. ports to be transported on ships that are built, owned, and operated by United States citizens. This artificially increases the cost of shipping to non-continental U.S. lands by significantly restricting the number of vessels that can legally deliver goods. Just a few years prior, Sablan witnessed firsthand how the Jones Act led to a major shortage of rice imports to Guam, so he worked to ensure that it wouldn't negatively impact the future Commonwealth.
We went in and said, listen, Ambassador, we wanted this thing as an exemption. Not only they were too far away, but too costly. And there's a lot of ships traversing the Pacific that are not U.S. bottom.
The NMI delegates were insisting on conditions and exceptions that no other U.S. territories had ever been granted. To make such huge demands of the United States government was not an easy task for the people of the tiny, remote Mariana Islands, which had been a perennial colony of foreign powers for several hundred years.
We had to insist. We had good lawyers helping us. We sometimes look at other territories to make a point and to not to repeat what the others, or to do or to get something what the others don't have.
The U.S. also used the negotiations to secure something in its own interests, the long-term use of the islands for defense purposes.
The U.S. wanted the Sinamay for national defense, and it's almost unconditional. It's non-negotiable. And they wanted to also have Tinian for military, because during those days, it was really the focal point on national security. It's the deterrent factor.
The Commission agreed to the military's conditions, allowing the U.S. Navy to lease 2/3 of the island of Tinian. That lease continues to this day and is likely to be extended well into the 21st century. Additionally, the U.S. Navy has been allowed to use an unpopulated northern island called Farallon de Mendiniza as a target range during live fire exercises for several decades. One of the most hotly debated provisions related to who controlled the NMI's minimum wage. The aspiring territory was eager to raise wages but felt the local businesses couldn't handle a sudden jump to the federal rate. Sablan worried the federal minimum wage would be written into the covenant prior to its adoption.
And I was very concerned about that, because the implications in terms of moving the economy forward would be very anti-economic development if we were to be saddled with a higher wage rate. So again, we at the Commission voted to make it inapplicable.
But the negotiations weren't always a tense battle between opposing camps. On many issues, there was an alignment of interests. For example, both delegations agreed on the need for a unique provision known as the Section 902 consultations.
Section 902 of the Covenant basically says that the United States and the Commonwealth government agree to address issues affecting the relationship between the two entities. But any issues affecting the relationship would be addressed in Section 902, which is essentially it's a consultation process. It's not an arbitration or a court type thing.
As the talks wound down and the final document took on a clear shape, Ambassador Williams came up with a term that would come to signify the unique agreement forged between the U.S. and the future Commonwealth. He referred to it as a covenant, and that's how it has been referred to in the Northern Marianas ever since, even though its official name is the Covenant to Establish a Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in political union with the United States of America. On February 15, 1975, the delegations met in the school auditorium where their talks first began 27 months prior. They were there to officially sign the covenant agreement. Only 5 days later, it was unanimously approved by the Mariana Islands District Legislature. The agreement allowed for local governance of the islands but gave the United States the right to control foreign affairs. All federal tax revenue would return to the islands' coffers, in addition to an annual grant provided by the federal government. Neither the Jones Act nor the federal minimum wage would apply to the NMI, and local immigration policy would be largely controlled by the Commonwealth. The agreement granted U.S. citizenship to the people of the Mariana Islands and their descendants, but the NMI would not receive a delegate in the U.S. Congress or the right to vote for president. However, a special provision was made regarding the issue of land alienation, so that only persons defined as being of Northern Marianas descent could own land. The United States was obliged to provide the Commonwealth with military defense and a range of federal services and financial assistance programs, but it retained the right to operate military bases and other strategic activities in the Marianas. Finally, the covenant provided for a constitutional convention to outline the new government.
So I was pretty pleased. I felt that we've created a toolbox for economic development, for us to move forward economically. That everything is there and we are at our disposal and at our discretion. And that if we properly use those tools, we should be able to be more self-sustaining.
A plebiscite was scheduled for June of that year. NMI's voters would have the opportunity to approve or disapprove the covenant. Its advocates ran a campaign and community outreach efforts to drum up support. But the covenant also had its passionate detractors, and the threat of violence became real. Here's Mr. Santos.
We work so hard, and it's not an easy task, I tell you, because some people just don't like it. And during the campaign, sometimes they throw rocks at the group. Sometimes it's dangerous. We went through some difficulty and fear. And I got people working with me for my protection and my family. Sometimes they call home, and sometimes my family or my wife will answer the telephone, and then the caller would say, I'm going to put dynamite in your garage. So it's not that easy.
But on June 17, 1975, nearly 79% voted to approve the covenant. This sent a strong message to the U.S. Congress that the overwhelming majority of the people of the Northern Marianas were eager to be a part of the United States. In July of that year, President Gerald R. Ford officially informed the U.S. Congress of the covenant and sent a proposed joint resolution, which became HJR 549. Members of the Marianas Political Status Commission traveled to the nation's capital to lobby for its passage. But they weren't alone in their efforts. The commission was fortunate to have an ally in the form of outspoken California Congressman Philip Burton.
Burton is an amazing fellow. He's like strong-arming people. He will call up people and say, hey, the HR 549 is coming up. I want your support on this thing. That's his style, see? Burton is a very, very intense liberal. And he doesn't like people taking advantage of weak guys.
But there were also critics of the proposed Commonwealth within the House of Representatives. To the surprise of the commission, one of them was Congressman Antonio B. Wanpat, Guam's first delegate to Congress.
And he was a member of the Interior Committee chaired by Burton. And Burton really likes Tony Wanpat. And I get along with Tony. I respect him because, I call him Mr. Congressman because he's an important guy, yeah? But I will never forget that he was against it, and the reason why he was against it was because in his statement to Burton, he said, why are we giving the Northern Marianas a much better status than Guam, and they happen to be the enemies of the United States during the war? Can you believe that? That's what he said. I won't tell you what Congressman Burton said back to him, but it was something, wow, very strong,
Very colorful.
very strong punch that he kept quiet. So he just kept quiet and supported.
Burton's vigorous advocacy in Congress for the Northern Marianas left a lasting impression on Sablan and Tenorio.
In fact, one of the things that he wanted to make sure that on the first day of the covenant, of the Commonwealth, that the old people here would be entitled to the SSI program, Supplemental Security Income, which does not apply in Guam or I think even American Samoa. But they want to make sure that that applies here because he was concerned about the old age here. So the Social Security people sent in people here to make sure that this is implemented.
To witness the voting of the covenant in the House while it was, being debated, and Burton was up there defending it and saying, that people of the Northern Marianas wanted to become part of the United States, then now it's a good time to show the world that, we are this and that. I don't remember the whole thing he said, but at the very end, he called for to vote on the covenant the full House. He called for unanimous consent voting.
HJR 549 passed the House with unanimous consent. Afterward, Delegate Juan Pat conveyed his constituents' support for the measure by expressing their hope, quote, that this union will usher in a new era of goodwill, mutual cooperation, and eventual union of all Chamorros in the Marianas, end quote. The next step was to persuade the Senate to approve the covenant. But this was a task easier said than done.
We were very worried because most of the leadership, Senate leaderships, were against it.
According to Tenorio, a high-ranking U.S. senator from Rhode Island seemed especially distrustful of the proposed Commonwealth and its representatives.
Claiborne Pale was the chairman of the subcommittee on foreign affairs, and Claiborne Pale was very much against the covenant. He happened to be a Democrat, but he was going against the...
This is the same Senator Pale that started the Pale Grant.
It must be him, so he did something good, but man, that guy, that's the one that I said was, very critical to the CNMA, to the covenant. Claiborne Pale, he asked me this question, it's in the congressional record, it says, first of all, Mr. Tenorio, how did you get here? Where did you get your money to travel to the United States to testify? I was a senator there from Congress. I was representing the commission. Said, well, Mr. Senator, we have our own local tax. My expense was paid for by our local people, taxpayers from the Marianas district. We raised tax also. He kept quiet. Then the next comment he made was, you mean to tell me that if the Azores Islanders are voted to become part of the United States, we should grant them U.S. citizenship also? He said that. It's in the Senate hearing. I'll never forget that. I got a little bit ticked off. I was kind of snotty at that time too, I mean, I'm a young man and ready to fight. I was ready to confront. I say to Senator Peps, the senator, the Marianas people have been under the United States since the end of the war. We become a trust of the United States under the United Nations. And all we learn is U.S. from ABCD to Jack and Jill went up the hill. And I stopped right there. So he just kept quiet. That's it.
Another of the covenant's opponents was Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. But the commission thought he could be persuaded otherwise. So a few of its members scheduled a meeting with him at the Kennedy compound in Cape Cod. But as the commission would soon learn, that ship had already sailed.
So we were sitting on the steps of the Kennedy compound. Me, Eddie, and Manny, and I think Danny Munoz, and the doctor. We were sitting there waiting for Kennedy because he's supposed to come meet with us at the compound. So we were sitting down there, and the doctor looking out, He saw a sailboat going out of the channel. And he knows it belongs to the senator. So he said, well, gentlemen, look like the senator is... stood us up. He's going sailing.
As the Senate vote approached, the commission members became anxious about how it would fare. But the advocacy of Congressman Burton and strident support from Senators J. Bennett Johnston of Louisiana and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii helped overcome the opposing legislators. The covenant passed with 66 yes votes, despite only needing 51. On March 24, 1976, in the East Room of the White House, President Ford signed the covenant into law. The Interior Secretary issued an order on the same day, officially separating the new Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands from the rest of the Trust Territory. For Santos and Soblan, seeing their work endorsed by the leader of the free world was a euphoric experience.
Oh my God, man, we were so pleased. At least I was very pleased. It was very an honor for us to be there, witnessing this. Because the moment we signed this, the interim government started. So the boat gets into our court here.
It's a very rare occasion to even meet the President of the United States. And what more, witness the signing of the covenant, the work that we have done so much in the past. And finally we got it met. And it's a feeling that I still remember. But I really worked so hard for the people. And first, I am not a smart person. I am just a regular person, but I am a pusher. I push around. I never stop looking for answer. And answer I get.
The covenant was signed, and with that, the dream of a Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands was realized. But in many ways, the hardest work had just begun. With the law's passage, it was time for the members of the Marianas Political Status Commission to return home to help draft the Constitution, elect the new government, and appoint the Commonwealth's first judiciary. Looking back on what they accomplished, Mr. Tenorio is full of fond memories and hope for the future of the CNMI. When asked if the Northern Mariana Islands are a better place to live since the passage of the covenant, he replied,
Absolutely. I would say absolutely. And despite some of the deficiencies, maybe after the fact, we thought, well, we should have done a better job. I mean, yes, anybody can say that, but we did our very best, and even the members of the U.S. Congress would say, wow, we couldn't believe what the Northern Marianas is getting.
It's been 45 years since pen was put to paper and the CNMI was born through the signing of the covenant. It's a moment we continue to commemorate as a local holiday throughout the CNMI on the anniversary of its passage. We celebrate how much the Northern Marianas have grown since our humble days of being a Trust Territory district overcoming wartime devastation. We celebrate how the covenant has allowed new generations of leaders to follow in the footsteps of our framers. But most of all, we celebrate the ability to determine the course of our own collective destiny. The CNMI has faced hardships and scandals. The covenant hasn't always provided the answers or solutions we've needed. Parts of it have since been repealed, such as local control over immigration and the minimum wage. The political and legal battles continue on aspects of the agreement, such as land alienation and the increasing militarization of the Marianas. But as the world around us evolves, so too does the covenant. It stands as a framework for the continued evolution of the Northern Marianas, a paramount document drafted by a humble group of citizens who wanted something better for the people they called friends, neighbors, and family. Through the work of the Marianas Political Status Commission and the resulting covenant agreement, each generation here will inherit a blueprint to continue building the Marianas of tomorrow. I would like to take a moment to honor the members of the Marianas Political Status Commission who are no longer with us. Representing Rhoda, Benjamin T. Manglonia and Joannes R. Taimanyo. Representing Tinian, Jose R. Cruz, Francisco A. Hokuk, Bernard V. Hofschneider, and Herman M. Manglonia. Representing Saipan, Juan L. G. Cabrera, Vicente T. Kamatsu, Herman Q. Guerrero, Daniel T. Munya, Dr. Francisco T. Palacios, Joaquin I. Pangilinan, Felix F. Rabaleman, Oscar C. Rasa, Felipe A. Salas, and Jose C. Tenorio. Representing the Northern Islands, Olimpio T. Borja, Usaga Giminagung.
Thanks for listening to the 4th episode of Memoirs Pasifika. Be sure to check out our website where we share photos, newspaper clippings, and other archival media related to each episode's topic. If you enjoy the show, please take a minute to subscribe to our podcast and share it with friends. While subscribing, it would be great if you could also leave a positive review. Our 5th episode will be available in mid-June. In recognition of Pride Month, it explores the recent history of LGBTQ issues on Guam, with a focus on the 2015 lawsuit, which led to Guam becoming the first U.S. territory to legalize same-sex marriage. So tune in for that. It should be a good one. Until then, Saina Maasi and take care.
Memoirs Pasifika is supported through grants from Humanities Guahan, the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, the Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities, and the National Endowment for the Humanities.